Hello and welcome back to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, ecological, and political crises that we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is the economist John Harvey. John's a professor at the Texas Christian University, and he joined me to discuss the origins of capitalism and the alternatives to capitalism. I so enjoyed this because he really laid out essentially how we went from Adam Smith and the suggestion of the free market to, the nightmare dystopia that we live in today, and how ideology plays a role in that, how the relationship with government plays a role with that, and how, neoclassical economists are driving the world over a cliff, much like what Steve Keen says, but that also they genuinely believe it, and here's why they believe it. It was so interesting speaking with him. He's also full of anecdotes. It was really great fun. And I think what's most important is the message he says at the end of the episode that economics is dead. And if we want to change the world, which we must, we have to look to other professions and other kinds of people to do so. And he explains who he thinks those people are. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you do, please share it amongst your friends, family, and community. If you're loving the show, support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or also on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who support this project and keep it going every week. John, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So could you give a brief background of your career as an economist? And then we'll jump into the rest.
In fact, if I may, let me back up all the way to my undergrad.
Oh my God,
because
yes.
that actually turns out to be very important in terms of where this may be a link into the issues that are important in your show. My first major was physics. I have no earth. Well, I do know why, because I grew up during the space race and I wanted to be an astronaut. So, but it turned out to be incredibly boring. No offense to any physicists out there. So, and I realized I really enjoy the social sciences. So I went to political science. But I missed the modeling, the formal modeling. So then I ended up in economics, and economics was absolutely perfect for me. It was a social science, which emphasized the modeling. And so, that became actually I double majored in economics and political science. And then my senior year, I met a girl who was at work right now, but she still had 2 more years to go. So I stayed at the University of Tennessee for my PhD. Now, I'll get back into this more later if it comes up, but partway through the PhD, I got to thinking, oh my God, have I made a mistake? This is so incredibly unrealistic and uninspiring.
And this was an economics PhD.
Economics PhD.
Right.
That's exactly right. And with incredible things like, for example, that we learned a model where the Great Depression was because of, prices fell, which firms realized, but workers didn't. So firms lowered wages and workers quit voluntarily. So 25% unemployment in the United States during the Great Depression was because people quit voluntarily, which is insane. I mean, there was no welfare. There was no unemployment insurance. Their only choice was to work. And this was the kind of stuff I was learning in class. And I thought, what have I done? So then one day, the hand of God reached down. Turned out to be the hand of Paul Kubik, actually, but I didn't know that at the time. But Paul had left a book of his on my desk called A Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics. So I picked it up and started reading through it. And post-Keynesian economics is really the economics of Keynes. Sorry, this is this always.
No, keep going.
Yeah, Keynesian economics is not the same thing as what Keynes said. Right. So
right.
Keynesian economics is actually, in fact, Joan Robinson at Cambridge called Keynesian economics, she called it bastard Keynesianism, because it was the bastard offspring of the neoclassical mainstream and what Keynes had to say. And it left out, and I'll tell you the quick and easy way to differentiate the two. Neoclassical Keynesian economics, or what's just called Keynesian economics, still assumes that the economy fixes itself. We might need to step in and help it a little bit to get it to do this faster, but it's still going to fix itself. Keynes said, no, it doesn't. it can break down with high levels of unemployment and stay there indefinitely. So that part of Keynes, which was so incredibly important, got left out of mainstream economics entirely. So
Right.
that was in this book, though, this idea going back to Keynes. And I thought, okay, I'll do your PhD, and then I'll do what I want afterwards, which I did. I was naive. I didn't realize that's not really possible. I just got very lucky coming to the university I did. Um, so then I came to TCU, Texas Christian University, which is not really very Christian. My daughter, well, the one holdover, like so many universities, it was founded by religious order, and the one holdover is that everyone has to take one religion class. So my
Right.
daughter that went to TCU, she took Rastafarianism. So which is still technically Christianity, but nevertheless, you didn't have to take Christianity at all. So
Mm.
anyway, at TCU though, the research I wanted to do was rewarded. I didn't realize that wasn't true everywhere. So I've been there since 1987. So now I'm full professor, and they can't take that away. And I've been department chair twice, which I will never do again. And It's been a good place to be, but good places to be as a non-mainstream economist are shrinking.
So, why, just out of interest, why do you think that your university rewarded your kind of research, and what kind of research were you doing exactly?
Ah, I know exactly why they did. In the US, there was a school of thought that evolved in late 1800s, early 1900s called institutionalism, and it was founded by Thorstein Veblen, who was known for conspicuous consumption. He made up that idea, and pecuniary emulation, trying to spend money in a way that emulates how the rich spend their money, that sort of thing. And it was very popular in Texas, of all places, in Oklahoma. So at Texas Christian University at TCU, there were a number of institutionalists. In fact, I got my job because I didn't even apply to TCU initially because I was lazy. They wanted a writing sample, and I didn't want to put together a writing sample. But then the department chair at University of Tennessee and a bunch of the people at University of Tennessee had also come from Texas, strangely enough, and were institutionalists. But the department chair said, "Have you applied to TCU?" And I said, "No." He said, "We'll do." Because the department chair at TCU had been his office mate.
Right.
And so anyway, I then applied and got the job here. And so then it's very common in academia for there to be a ranking of journals in the department.
Yeah.
Think outside the box, come up with new stuff as long as it fits in these 10 journals. All right. So um, it's very damaging. And
Mm,
the same thing has happened in Europe too, where they have all these rankings and so forth for universities. Well, then you have to maximize the ranking, and there's no way
yeah.
to do something different. TCU, so therefore the places I publish would have been the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, which is the post-Keynesian stuff that's closer to what Keynes originally did, and the Journal of Economic Issues, which is the Veblen stuff. Well,
Mm,
I didn't realize this at the time, but had I gone somewhere else, those wouldn't have really counted. But at TCU, those are like, oh, sure, those are great publications. We believe in that background. So it was just luck
right.
that I ended up here, and also means, I mean, not that it's a bad place, it's not at all. But it also meant I'm kind of stuck here.
Mm,
That it was really hard to find a job somewhere else. But I mean, I didn't want to. But
mm.
if I had wanted to, then that would have been very difficult to do so.
Yeah, this is what I've gathered from Steve Keen, that
Right,
I mean, he's just like, neoclassical economists are destroying the world and are the
right,
reason for
right,
the
right.
climate crisis.
Yeah,
But that it seems, despite more and more and more people coming out, evidence coming out, that the ideology of neoclassical economists is that it is an ideology, not a science. And there is so much to support that the economy works very, very differently. Their main guys are still winning Nobel Prizes and writing policies and running the world
yeah,
off a cliff.
because they're giving out the Nobel Prizes. So it's not terribly surprising that they would also get them. I'll tell you something about neoclassical economics and neoclassical economists. People sort of socialize with on the internet, say a number of times, well, it's a big conspiracy, that they all know it's not really true. That's not true. I mean, I
Yeah.
have known neoclassical economists and these are from non-economists, by the way. People that
Mm,
are big into modern monetary theory, that sort of thing. I was like, well, that's not
mm,
actually true. I've known most of the economists I know are neoclassicals, and they just honestly believe that's the way the world works. I mean, there's a very strong self-selection bias. If you
yeah.
don't think that's how it works, then you get out of getting a PhD, which is what I almost did. And in fact, at the last poll I saw, um, professional economists, PhDs, voted Democrat over Republican, a ratio of like 2.5 to 1. Now, I know
Oh, wow.
Democrat is more neoliberal than it used to be, but that's
Mm,
always been true, is that economists tend to think of themselves as liberal. Um,
right.
and let me give you an example of what happens. I have a colleague, really, really great guy. And hope he doesn't listen to this because he might be able to figure out it was him. But then he also probably laugh. But back when I was department chair the first time, he was not tenured yet. So I sat in on his class in order to write a review of his course. And he was talking about macroeconomics, unemployment, inflation, GDP growth. And he was talking about when people save more money, this drives down interest rates and firms invest more. I was okay. So it was a very good lesson. But I said to him afterwards, if people are saving more, then why would firms invest more since people aren't buying stuff? He said, I don't know. I never thought about that. So,
Mm,
I mean, if you don't think about stuff like that, have you heard of the article by Paul Romer? Paul Romer, who also won a Nobel Prize not too long ago, neoclassical economist. And it's called The Trouble with Macroeconomics. You can look it up online. And he
okay.
says that for the past 30 years, economics or macroeconomics, and by this he means neoclassical, has gone backwards. And there was a version of the paper that he eventually amended that said that it really no longer qualifies as scientific research, that it's become so well, he says that, things are actually determined in these models by like trolls, that it's not actions that humans are carrying out. It's these sort of random shocks from elsewhere. It's trolls and fairies and this sort of thing. And he got a PhD in his, school of thought. And I happened to be on a panel with him before he got the PhD. I like to think I put him over the top. And he said that when he wrote this paper, he absolutely caught hell. From the believers, not because they thought he was wrong, but because how dare he say bad things about their founders like Milton Friedman and
Mm,
Robert Lewis. How dare he do that? He's like, but if they're wrong, they're wrong. So
yeah.
I really think a big factor nowadays is just self-selection. And I'll tell you this too: a lot of younger neoclassical economists don't even do macro anymore. They think it's ridiculous themselves. So they do all this micro stuff that honestly is not
Sorry,
great
could you
either.
define quickly macro and
Yeah,
micro as well for listeners?
that's a good question. Not every school of thought splits it up that way. And you don't have, for example, Marxists thinking of economics as being micro and macro. It's just this is the way the capitalist system works. But in neoclassical economics, um, macro is the whole nation. For example, and then you're talking about unemployment, inflation, GDP growth, potentially income distribution, although they usually don't bring that up. Whereas micro is the economic behavior of the
Right.
individual firm or the individual household or whatever. And one of the central tenets of their micro is that social factors really are unimportant, which of course makes us kind of different from every other social science. That people act independently of each other, that they are not affected by everyone else's preferences.
Oh, come on.
Oh, I know. It's insane. And they have this rationality assumption that everyone is rational. We explain this behavior by that must be the rational way to do it. Um,
Yeah.
and it kind of boils down to if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't have done it. So, okay, the people at Jonestown, when they all drank the Kool-Aid, you're right. They did it because they wanted to do it. But the really interesting question is, why did they want to do it?
Mm,
And that's what institutionalism looks at. Whereas economics then says, oh, that's not us, that's sociology. And by the way, we make fun of sociology. So, their questions really aren't important in the first place. So that's the
yeah.
micro and macro stuff, and a lot of all of our newest economists in the department are all microeconomists, and they all do things like say, real estate, natural resource stuff. And the natural resource stuff is not what we would hope it would be. It's all about
Mm,
well, we charge firms for polluting. We do these
mm,
cost benefit analyses. Can we afford really to not pollute that lake? And you can pay for the right to pollute it, and then you can sell the rights and so forth. It's all very market
yeah.
oriented. The idea
Polluting
that
credits.
capitalism it's interesting. The idea that capitalism is part of the problem is there, but the idea that we should therefore shift significantly away towards, say, degrowth, for example, is not there. It's like, well, we just amend capitalism. So, but there's actually apparently a department in the U.S. and it wasn't identified in the article I was reading, that has considered no longer requiring that their graduate students take a class in macroeconomics. So you can have somebody graduate with a PhD in economics with no background in what causes GDP, unemployment, inflation, all the things that are most important to us. Instead, we're going to play around with math, and which is fun. I mean, I was a physics major at first, but ultimately, I kind of wanted to solve world problems, and not problems like should there be speed bumps in a neighborhood. And I know that's interesting on some level. I don't want to, we had a guy come interview for a job with us, and that was his paper. Does it really slow? What does it do to housing prices, having speed bumps in a neighborhood? And I just kind of feel like maybe there are bigger problems going on right now. I just finished watching Good Vibrations, which is a great, great film about the Irish punk movement. And at one point, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, they come into this pub and they ask this girl if she's, of age to drink. And the star of the show says, "Excuse me, officer, I'd like to report a revolution outside. But, you go ahead and check to see if she's 18 while the killing and the intimidation and so forth goes on." So that's kind of the way I feel about neoclassical micro. Yeah, that's great that speed bumps, raise or lower, but we've got income distribution problems. We have climate problems that are existential, and so on. And economics is kind of giving up on looking at those. Or if you've talked to Steve Keen, looking at them in an extremely simplistic, biased way. And yet these people honestly think they're doing good. And, the fellow I mentioned earlier that I had observed his lecture, he has started emailing me things about what's bad about neoclassical economics. So it kind of has to sit there for a while. Yeah, you can't convert someone all at once. You have to plant a seed and have them think, yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. Same thing happened to me. I'd been trained one way. Granted, I was already disappointed with it in graduate school, but it took a while to reject one thing after another. Because, once you've learned it a certain way, then you frame the problem that way. Some guy named Einstein once said that the theory, let's say, what you see depends on the theory you're using, or something like that, along those lines. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But,
The paradigm. So
yeah.
then, I suppose the thing, because I know very little about economics, I read a couple of books in 2016. I'm not sort of built for the math part of it. And I think that it's this really fuzzy realm that dominates so much of our individual social existence, and our professional existence, our lived existence. And yet it's not something very many of us understand. And I suppose one thing I'd be interested to kind of poke at with you would be, like, what is the difference between not economics and capitalism? Like, how has economics driven capitalism from Hayek and
Right.
Friedman talking about the necessity of, government intervention and regulating the market to
Yeah.
this late stage, every man for himself, cowboy capitalism? How did economics drive that? Because I assume, it would be economic theory that just kind of ran away with itself that did.
Right. Actually, I have a book on this.
Oh, fab.
So yeah, and Contending Perspectives in Economics. And it's kind of funny how I ended up writing it. Well, at our university, some years ago, back before there were so many neoclassicals in the department, we were at a departmental retreat, and somebody brought up that, hey, students sometimes not complain per se, but say that, I learned so and so in Dr. Harvey's class, and I learned so and so in Dr. Butler's class. Why was it so different? And so the idea came up, that they're not real clear on the idea that there are many different schools of thought in economics. In fact, we even though in political science or sociology or whatever, you might do different schools of thought, economics doesn't. Economics acts as if there's one school of thought and that's it. Indeed, there was a pedagogical paper that came out once by a guy named John Siegfried with a co-author I can't remember, where he said that, this was talking to high school students, don't tell them there's more than one school of thought, because that might confuse them. Oh my God, it makes students excited. Oh, you mean so-and-so hates
Yeah.
so-and-so? That's interesting.
Yeah.
So we decided to teach a class not only teach it, but require a course of all our majors. The fact that we teach it makes us very unusual, but require it of all of our majors, contending perspectives in economics, where you have to cover at least a couple of different schools of thought. When I do it, I do it sort of a shotgun approach. I do neoclassical, Marxist, Austrian, post-Keynesian, institutionalist, new institutionalist, feminist, and ecological. But I wanted a book for this when I first taught it. And I found a book from a publisher, Edward Elgar, that was like 20 years old. And also, it was a different author for every chapter. And it was also clear sometimes that the author writing the chapter didn't believe that school of thought. Okay, well, I mean, that's not the right way to teach it. And so I went to the Elgar booth at a conference and spoke to it. Not the same Edward Elgar, by the way, that's a famous composer. He said, I asked him once if he was related. He said, probably, but I mean, not that he was aware. But there's a big publisher in economics and social sciences. Somehow he talked me into writing that book. He said, no, we don't have a book. Why don't you do one? And I had absolutely no desire to do this. So anyway, I have a book on different schools of thought, and it goes over, in particular, and this is what I'm going to talk about now, how did neoclassicism end up pushing everyone else out? So let me back up all the way to Adam Smith, right? So, you have Adam Smith in 1776, and, pressing for free markets, because his sense was that, and he was much deeper than this. He really was. But this is what people took away and emphasized today. Everyone's greedy and everyone's rational. Therefore, if the government is granting monopolies, as they were in England in the 18th century, then they're just going to screw us over. They're greedy and they're not stupid. So, if I am the only licensed jam and jelly maker in England, then I haven't got to work myself to death, to do. So he said, what if we just say anyone can make jams and jellies? Then there's an incentive to please the consumer rather than to please the seller. So that's a very appealing idea, and I'm quite sure it works really well in some contexts. I always think of restaurants that. Now, we also need to make sure that we inspect restaurants, otherwise they'd kill us all with poison. Well, then they would shut down, as the libertarians would say. But I don't want to have somebody to die to find that out. But nevertheless, I mean, you see restaurants come and go as people, well, I started to say stop eating Mexican food. I live in Texas, so that we don't stop eating Mexican food. But whatever the style is. But then that leads into, David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus and so forth. And by the Great Depression, there were, it wasn't all pro-market. And you can pull pro-market out of Smith there. And again, he was deeper than that. But nevertheless, we have the free market revolution in England that then, the impact on the Irish famine is very famous. That, well, we can't interfere with the market. My gosh, if we fed these people, it would drive the prices down. And so that really, won over in England. Then, but by the Great Depression, okay, so we get Marx in mid 1800s, Keynes in the 1930s, Thorstein Veblen in the late 1800s. And so we've got several different schools of thought, and there was some conversation among them. All right. So it wasn't all capitalism yet. And the Austrians are in the mix by then. It was a little bit broader than that. Not a lot broader, but certainly the institutionalists had, Keynes is saying, let's keep as much of the capitalist system as we can, but let's get rid of the parts that really suck. And he also declared himself a socialist. The institutionalists are like, well, whatever works. I mean, so, if that's a good solution in this context, that's great. If it's not, we'll do something else. But then, the Great Depression comes along, which gives the economics discipline, the mainstream, a bad name, because we went from, oh gosh, I have the data here close by, but around 4% unemployment in the U.S. to almost 25 a couple of years later. And you would think and there's no social support system at this point. You would think that if I'm paying taxes or tuition dollar to support these professors, you'd think they'd have something to say about this and help us fix it. And it was really confused. I mean, there were people that were saying the right thing, and, Keynes, for example, but the way he said it's a hard book to read, because he ended up having to sort of back off of things he believed in order to make it understandable. So anyway, economics gets a bad reputation during the Great Depression. I've read a couple of different stories of how neoclassicism, sort of ended up being the school of thought and the one that pushes for capitalism. So this is one of the stories. Then World War II starts, and we're suddenly at full employment. Right? The problem of less than full employment is gone. The problem of the economy not fixing itself is gone, which it didn't. I mean, the war actually fixed it, but and suddenly a school of thought that focuses on the idea that everyone already has a job or they soon will, which is neoclassicism. Well, they actually had some useful things to say because their school of thought focuses on how to allocate resources when they're all already being employed. Well, with 25% unemployment, we've got lots of unemployed resources, people, obviously. And so as a consequence, they actually had some useful answers, right? So that was one part of the how they pulled ahead of everyone else. That's story one, that neoclassicism actually proved to be relatively useful through the war years because there was a period of very, very low unemployment. It was 1.8, 1.9% unemployment in the US. And so the problem that Keynes and the institutionalists are talking about isn't there. All right. So they don't have to worry about that. But really, I think the far bigger thing was the Cold War. That once World War II is over, any school of thought that says something that isn't consistent with, oh my gosh, capitalism is wonderful, is suspect, more than suspect. You could lose your job. All right. If you said anything that was negative. I have a second edition of my book just came out, and I really went back in and found a lot more evidence for that particular story. And my gosh, that there was a story I was reading. I think it was Congressional Quarterly, reporting these wonderful findings of how many communist teachers we got rid of in California, how many we got rid of in New York and so forth. One of them was a kindergarten teacher. They believed that a kindergarten teacher was pushing Marx, so they fired this person. I found a letter from whatever the Harvard newspaper is, and these students said, "Look, this is quashing academic freedom. Even people who wouldn't necessarily, be Marxist or left leaning are just keeping their mouths shut. They just don't even want to raise the issue because you can lose your job over this." So apparently, my professors at Tennessee, who had been originally University of Texas and learned institutionalism, this was a big problem there. I mean, here in the state of Texas, we've got it again right now, and sort of vetting people on the basis of their politics. And so this really beat certainly Marxism, but institutionalism and post-Keynesian economics, both of which said there's a fundamental flaw in capitalism. We can do things to address it, but it doesn't just fix itself. And that didn't go over well. So by the time the Berlin Wall fell, though, it was too late because I'd mentioned earlier all these lists of journals you can publish in. Those were already established. And it's really, really hard, even when you think it ought to be changed, to change something that's so deeply ingrained. We don't have a journal ranking system in our department. I hope we never do, because we feel as if it was an article that was refereed, went out, and other professors read it, then okay, good enough. I mean, if you got one that would normally be ranked really high by the average economist, sure, we'll make an extra argument for you, in your raise or whatever. But that's not the case. And even I hate to say this, but even really tiny schools that no one even knows about have got like these. I show my students when I'm teaching the class based on that volume, that this one very small university, their econ department has like these are the 5-point journals, these are the 3-point journals, these are the 1-point journals. Well, good Lord, if it's 5-to-1 to get in this journal versus this one, and if you don't get tenure after your first 6 years, then you're fired. They give it a nice name, but you're fired. So you have to work within this box. So during the Cold War, we had this active assault on any school of thought that might raise questions about the perfection of capitalism. And then by the time the Cold War is over, we have made all these journal lists, and macroeconomics in particular got more and more unrealistic to the point that even the people themselves in that school of thought don't want to pursue it anymore. So that's how I think neoclassicism became, your original question was neoclassicism and capitalism. Well, during the Cold War, only things that were consistent with capitalism, which, by the way, there are aspects of neoclassicism that would say, well, no, we shouldn't use the market in that context. You kept your mouth shut, during the Cold War. And so by the time we beat this out of all these people, we now have a school of thought that is full of people who think of themselves as liberal, and yet nevertheless pushing this neoliberal agenda.
Mm.
And I was talking to, I don't know if you know Jamie Galbraith at University of Texas. His father, John Kenneth Galbraith, was a very, very famous economist in the 70s at Harvard. He was also John F. Kennedy's. Well, he was active in the government during the Depression and the World War II, and then he was ambassador to India, I believe, under Kennedy. So this is his son, and he's also an excellent economist. He's down at University of Texas, and he held these conferences every now and then. And this was the end of the conference where we're all drinking beer, and I said to him, um, "What do you think the chances are of saving the economics discipline?" "Oh, none, none whatsoever. There's nothing we can do."
Mm.
I said,
Mm.
"Okay, then what do we do instead?" And he said, "Well, what we're doing right here," which was having a conference with policymakers, with people. There were a few economists, Stephanie Kelton, Pavlina Tchernova, and so forth, but mostly policymakers and lawyers. And I'm talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But economics is gone. It's dead. So, and I think that's probably right. Um, I don't know. On the other hand, I'm more optimistic than I have been in all. How long have I been an economist? This will be my third. This will be my 36th year, I think, at TCU. Uh, and way back in grad school, a grad school colleague of mine, Chris Brown, he and I got invited to go out to lunch with Ann Mayhew, Terry Neal. Those are two really big names in institutionalism, and Paul Davidson, who was a big name in post-Keynesian economics, and Alfred Eichner, who also in post-Keynesian economics. And so we just sat there in awe. And they started talking about, remember back when we thought we could make a change and then we didn't? And I thought, great. I'm sitting here just starting my career, and these giants in my schools of thought that I think make sense saying that we didn't make a difference. Uh, but they did, because they kept alive the ideas. I don't know if you've talked to any MMT people or Stephanie Kelton or have you heard of Stephanie?
I haven't, but I know vaguely of MMT and have read around it. But modern
Right.
monetary theory, yeah, not yet. Haven't cracked
Yes.
open
Oh,
that
well,
nut yet.
she had a volume that was on the New York Times bestseller list that just came out, gosh, a couple years ago. But she was taught by these people. They kept it alive, and she was, of course, Bernie Sanders' chief economist.
Right.
And so, oh my God, you know, finally getting into the place where we can actually make a difference policy wise. Of course, then the Democratic Party made sure he didn't win. Um, but nevertheless, and I was just at a conference. I mentioned lawyers because if economics discipline is truly dead, then where are we going to get people who are going to be pushing ideas and policies that are more consistent with what we
Yeah.
need to do to fix the planet and to fix income distribution and so forth? Um, I was at the Levy Institute in New York, which is a sort of post Keynesian think tank, and they had a summer school for people who wanted to come and learn about this. And I was talking to Rowan Gray, who's originally Australian, and he's a lawyer, and he says, think about this. He says, we're lucky to get, I don't know, 10 PhD economists in our school of thought a year on the planet. He said, if you got 10% of law school students, this would be a massive number of people. And he says, and so much of what this our school of thought is talking about is sort of a realistic vision of the way the power structure actually works and how to get things done and so forth. And he says lawyers he has found are very open to the ideas of our school of thought. Well, yeah, of course it works that way. That
Mm.
makes sense because that's the way the law is structured. So I haven't gone anywhere with that, but it did make me feel good. I was like, okay, well, yeah. I mean, if econ is dead, then and he's been organizing groups and so forth to try to get folks on the side of sort of more progressive politics, pardon me, more progressive economics.
Mm.
And yeah, it's depressing in some ways. It's like when you're talking about climate change, it's horribly depressing in some ways, but there are a few lights of hope. For example, the younger generation are sick and tired of the planet having been destroyed by my generation. And if they can only all get out and vote, and the Democrats not end up fixing the election, then we could make some progress. But I take hope from my students that I see, and from my children. My daughters are, their twins are 28, and their friends. I was like, okay, these people are not. When I was in college in the 1980s, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Wall Street with Charlie Sheen
Hang on, sorry.
and
I have to jump in and say something
oh,
though.
yeah, yeah,
Because you said, the young people, they need to go out and vote, and hopefully Democrats can, get in and make changes. But I mean, surely part of the problem now is that all leading parties are kind of caught in the growth maxim paradigm, because it's been sold so well to the public that the vast majority of the public who do not have the time to sit and think about post-Keynesian economics and educate themselves about
right,
these kinds of things because they're trying to get food on the table. This is the kind of the comfortable known that they will continue to vote for. So, I mean, surely we need we need new narratives, we need new stories, we need new kinds of theories. We need to be. I think it's really interesting that lawyers are keen on a different kind of economics and a different kind of way of organizing because it's in the law, it's written there
right,
already. It's like
right,
we seem to be sort of functioning in this sort of shadow reality, like this mirror
yeah,
image of what the world actually is. So I want to understand more what you think about what can be done to change the current system that is, seeing millions in developed country being plunged into poverty and like fuel poverty, yeah, homing poverty, all this kind of thing.
right,
And then
right,
also, is exposing the most vulnerable nations in the world and most vulnerable peoples to the climate crisis because of extractive capitalism. What do we
right,
do
right.
about all of this?
Well, first of all, the election of Donald Trump, we can say a lot of
Hmm.
things about that. I think suggested that people are not okay with just the status quo, the
Hmm.
sort of
Hmm.
politician. And uh, my vision of Bernie Sanders was that this was the non establishment candidate on the other side,
Yeah.
and that would have been much more successful than Hillary Clinton. And even if he wasn't, I don't know. I guess the way I come down on that is, um, if my car is broken down and I have to wait to sort of schedule it to be repaired, and I can easily get in at the repair facility that I know won't fix it, or I can try to get into the one that's going to fix it, but it's going to be harder to get my car in there. I kind of want the one that could possibly fix it. And that's the way I kind of view sort of the establishment Democrats. Okay, maybe I'm not even convinced of that, but maybe they have a better chance of winning. But I don't know. Heading towards the cliff of climate change, I figured Trump had his foot on the gas.
Mm.
Biden would let up off the gas, but but Sanders would actually hit the brake, which is a really good
Yeah.
idea. Maybe turn the wheel a little bit. So
Yeah.
but one of the things you said there, people don't know any other way. It's hard for them to see. Well, I don't know. It's complicated. On the one hand, I don't know that people are necessarily using, you know, neoclassical economics to understand the world. Uh, in fact, I think maybe there's the problem. There's the problem. The group of economists who are advising both the Republicans and the Democrats are the same group. They're the same pool.
Yeah.
So even if they envision different problems, they're really just drawing from a slightly different part of of the same fundamentalist school that says, "Well, yeah, that'd be great, but you can't do that." Is what they're getting from their
Mm.
advisors. I mean, what's his name? Obama. I mean, you know, one of his chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors was Christina Romer, who's no relation, by the way, to the Paul Romer I mentioned earlier. But she has an encyclopedia entry that I quoted from time and again. It's on business cycles, the economy going up and down, space of recession. And she says, really, there aren't business cycles, and that economists believe the economy could stay at full employment forever. So that's that whole thing going back to they think that it just fixes itself. This
Yeah.
is Democrats' economists, not the
Yeah.
Republicans' economists, the Democrats' economists. So even as people begin to be disgusted with the way the world is and are going off towards Trump on one side and Sanders on the other, the people who end up advising them, with very few exceptions, I mentioned Stephanie Kelton with Sanders, but for the most part, they're the ones telling them, well, yeah, that is a problem, but we can't address it that way. We have to work within the context of capitalism. They don't word it that way. They just they
Mm,
describe the solution that way.
mm,
So uh, I don't know what to do other than what Jamie Galbraith was talking about in terms of we got to get right to the policymakers, because we have to break the link between the economists who are saying this is the only way it can be done and the policymakers, and get that apart.
mhm,
Um, Maybe interject ourselves in there. I'm not sure that people would have a big problem with it, especially as one of my colleagues, his daughter said, "We just need you to die." She didn't literally mean for him to die, but she said, in order to get the policies put in place that we want as younger people, we need you to stop voting or just be gone.
mm.
And so I think that especially younger people have I think, a clearer idea of what the problems are. Um, but as long as those political parties in the US, for example, are being advised by those same economists who can't see past their training, and I
Yeah,
don't, to some extent, I don't blame the politicians. I'm not going to make up my own economics. And if this is
yeah,
what this person says, see, when I was in college, it was the '80s, and it was greed is good, and it
mm,
was Reagan Thatcher, and
yeah,
so we have this whole. Well, I'm 61, so I graduated college in '83. So, 61 to 50 or whatever, all these people grew up with Reagan and Thatcher and thinking, well, it's unfortunate, but these miners, we've got to shut down the mines, and God forbid we find something else for them to do. The market's supposed to do that.
mm.
But yeah, so as a quick answer to your question, we got to break the link between the economics discipline and the policymakers. And I think that's more possible now than it has been before.
Yeah, I think people are definitely crying out for a kind of change, but I think, degrowth is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And degrowth is like when you look at what it's actually suggesting, it's amazing, but it
Yeah.
is such a fundamental opposition to the world. It is painting a whole new world.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
what I've been thinking about recently is that what is difficult about explaining a whole new world to people is explaining to them also by the time you get there, you will also be different. Like your reaction to it now is not the reaction that you would have
Right, right,
given the
right,
5 or 10 year period to get there. Like you will have
right.
already adapted to so many different parts of it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think when, precarity is going through the roof and people just feel really, really insecure, they want to hold on to something memorable, something from the
Comfortable,
past that was
yeah,
good. Yes, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And I think that's why Trump, I actually don't think he wasn't an establishment candidate, but he wasn't a particularly radical candidate either. He didn't create a vision for America. He just said, let's make it great again. He just wanted to go backwards into the past. He wanted to reindustrialize it. He wanted to essentially say to America, I think he won the vote because he said to a bunch, working class America, um, hey, it was better for you back then, and we're just gonna kind of hop in our time machine, and that is totally
Right.
feasible,
And
but
white
because it's
male,
much more difficult to create a vision.
right,
Sorry?
white male working class America,
Yes, yeah,
is
yeah,
who he was
yeah, yeah,
appealing to,
yeah,
because some of
yeah,
the stuff that eventually got written off that he said early on, anyway, but yeah, so there's probably a lot of racism and sexism involved in his message, as well.
oh god,
Um,
yeah. That's a
yeah,
given.
yeah, yeah, and, talking about going to degrowth, and this is why I think
Sure.
that the MMT stuff and the different school of thought is so important. Okay, so let's say that I am convinced that I don't need a new one of these, every couple of years, because quite
Mm.
honestly, I haven't figured out what this one does yet. That's going to be part of degrowth. I'm satisfied with it. I
Your
don't need.
phone.
Yes, that's right. Well, I'm satisfied with it, and if it breaks or something, that's fine. But otherwise, I don't need to get a new one that has a camera that is marginally or even significantly better. But it's not. My eyes can't tell the difference anyway.
Yeah.
Um, so let's say we do that. What happens to the people who make cell phones? I mean, and this is what if you continue to think in the context of capitalism and neoclassical economics, that becomes the problem. Like, well,
Yeah.
yeah, but we destroy these jobs. Okay, fair enough. All right. So, and this is where the Stephanie Kelton and the MMT stuff and the post Keynesian stuff and the institutional stuff comes from. This, all right. There are things that are socially useful and profitable. Great, let the private sector do those things. There are things that probably really aren't very socially useful, but profitable. And I'm gambling, for example. So, okay, but we can. But there are many, many, many things that are socially useful and not profitable. All right, and those will never get done in our system. Never get done. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're on the scale that is necessary.
Yeah.
Climate change, elderly care, which is going to become a bigger and bigger problem.
Yeah.
National health, public education, all these things. So, okay, so the government does those. And well, but the government can't afford to do it. Well, of course they can. The United States can never become bankrupt in dollars, all right, because they make them up as they go along. They make dollars on these, all right, right here.
Keyboards.
Keys. Yeah. And they do it all the time. And the UK could do it too, because they're not in the EU. Once you join the EU, things get really complicated and not necessarily very good, as Greece found out, because Greece had a lot of debt, but it was in euros. It wasn't their currency. When Mexico had a financial crisis in 1994, it wasn't in pesos. It was in dollars that they couldn't pay back. So the government, well, when World War II is the perfect example. There was right now there's this opposition to the government becoming heavily involved or more heavily involved in the economy because that's socialism. But in World War II, when the U.S. drove unemployment, it was still in double digits when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And all of a sudden it becomes 1.8, 1.9% by 43 or 44. There was no philosophical opposition because this isn't socialism. This is fighting for freedom. Okay, but we could do the exact same thing, and we do it every day. Think of it this way: for every unemployed person is receiving some income and are able to, with that income, go to a grocery store and take things off the shelf. Right? What if? And we should not, rather than waiting around for the private sector to hire that person. In fact, let me back that up and use this example instead. There's a lot of opposition over here on the left to things like self-checkout lanes. I don't know how popular that's become in the UK, but
They're everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, and at the airport, you check yourself in and stuff. I love it because I'm an introvert. I've got my headphones in. I'm listening to music. I don't want to talk to anybody. I go to the self-checkout lane. Well, you're putting somebody out of work. Okay, then do you bank at a bank that doesn't use computers? Because that's going to require a lot more people to keep track of everything if your bank doesn't use computers. Well, no, I don't do that. Well, then, so you're not against technology replacing labor, capital replacing labor. You're just against anything new. Why draw the line here? Why not draw the line 10 years from now? Or really the more relevant question is, why are we using an economic system that punishes us for using the technology as much as we can use it? Why do we have an economic system that when a grocery store replaces 3 employees by putting in these self-checkout lanes, why can't we do that? Because
but
we're
it's not
depending entirely on the market system to hire them back. Yeah.
because I was going to say, the economic system does not punish us. It punishes workers. Like
Right,
the economic
right.
system is built to punish labor in order to drive down the price of labor and built to reward capital.
Right.
So
And that's why
capital is massively getting rewarded in that scenario.
right. And that's why the idea with my school of thought is that, well, the government stands ready to hire anyone who cannot find a job in the private sector at any time. All right. We obviously can afford, quote unquote, afford because the food's there. You can't think in terms of money. You have to think in terms of resources. The housing is there. The food is there. The clothing is there because we don't let people starve when they are unemployed. So why not have them? Why sit and wait for something that is likely to never happen? And that is to have that grocery store rehire the workers they laid off. Right? They're not going to do that. To the private sector, labor is a cost. So we have the government stand ready to hire anyone who is willing to work. Pavlina Tchernova has done tons of work on this, and there's a really nice book on it. And it's actually a relatively popular idea with people on the right and the left to do this. But boy, capital wouldn't like it because now think about this. we can get rid of the minimum wage laws in the United States. Because let's say that our government wage is $20 an hour. All right. So, okay. So I can work for McDonald's at $10 an hour, or I can work for the government at 20. Well, I know what I'm going to do. So McDonald's is going to have to raise wages. And I'm not going to play the same games in terms of race and gender. So all of a sudden, if I, in a disadvantaged class, can get a decent job with the government, then I don't have to worry about the private sector screwing me over. And it will put a lot of pressure on the private sector to reward labor fairly. I know fair is hard to define, but I know it's not what it is right now. And there's no reason we can't afford to do this. Furthermore, these people can be working in areas like climate change. It's not all just digging ditches, although it can be. You can be training people. And the idea that Pavlina talks about is that if the private sector expands, great. The private sector has a group of trained people who have been working to draw from them for their labor. Unemployed people have a very hard time getting a job, ironically. That the longer they're unemployed, the more difficult it is to find a job, because this is seen as a negative signal by the firm. So, okay, you don't have that anymore. There are pockets of chronic unemployment in every city. And have you ever seen the U.S. Series The Wire?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God, it's really good. Set in Baltimore, and the drugs and so forth. And it would always be, and I keep saying to Melanie, my wife, until she asked me to stop talking about it. If only had a job program, there wouldn't be all these unemployed, kids in the inner city, and we wouldn't have to have the show. Because what else do they have? But you're a young entrepreneurial person in this area of town. Well, I sell drugs. I mean, that's the way I work my way up. Wouldn't it be nice for another alternative? And there absolutely could be.
It sounds like a green job guarantee, really, which is another degrowth policy. But I hadn't heard it be articulated through government, which I suppose it would have always had to be. But then, does government want this, though? Does government actually want it? Because arguably government is doing such a bad job of governing its populace, apart from governing them into fear. One could argue that they're not that interested in the well-being of their citizens, certainly in the economy. Like, let's stick with the UK and the US right now. I mean, the UK just outlawed protesting. We don't think they really care for their citizens over here.
That's like when the EU said what Greece did when they had the referendum that said, we're not going to pay this back. You're not allowed to do that anymore. This whole democracy thing doesn't trump, that's taken on a whole new meaning, hasn't it? But that doesn't trump, the European Central Bank. But what they want. No, that's why we need older people to die, because we need them to stop voting. We need them, because it's one thing to say that someone like Trump exists. This is the thing that's so terrifying over here. It's one thing to say that he exists, but he lost the election, but all his followers are still here. All the people that thought it was an okay thing. So, and unfortunately, some of them aren't hundreds of years old. But no, so long as the political system is the way it's working right now, and I don't know what to do about that. I majored in political science undergrad, but I did all the international stuff. So that's a problem that you would really need to talk to Roland Gray, the guy that I mentioned earlier, the lawyer, who has worked in trying to get policy passed and so forth, has a very realistic sense of how that actually gets done under the current system. But yeah, no, if we're going to push degrowth, there has to be an alternative for those people who are no longer, now I remember how I got into this, who are no longer, working at the cell phone factory, or who are no longer working at a register at a store. There needs to be an alternative for them. And that's what it is. We should never, by the way, we talked about this at the conference I mentioned at the Levy Institute. And it was Roland Gray, who I was on a panel with him. And he said, he called our panel a manel, because it was all white males. And he says, we have to do something about this. And of course, Stephanie and Pavlina are both women, so that's really good leaders in our movement. But you also have to leverage your privilege, because I'm really good with rich white men, and so because they'll listen to me and say, okay, if they're going to listen to me, I'm going to tell them. And something that they don't react negatively to is, we know in the private sector, labor is a cost. So the private sector has every reason to minimize the use of labor. And
Mm,
as new technologies are invented, or the grocery store, you go to the airport, you check yourself in, it says there's a excellent chance that the demand for labor will go down and down and down. So we need an alternative. And they're like, oh, okay. And that makes sense to them. And then you get around to the government spending part. Now, I say that I mentioned earlier that you can't convince someone all at once. You have to let things sit with them. Melanie saw that particular talk, my wife, 3 times before she said, oh, now I get the whole thing. Because it's
mm.
such a change from the way we've been thinking so far. But I like to think I plant seeds of doubt in the minds of rich white men, and make them think, okay, I'm not going to mention the fact that I also teach a class on the economics of race and gender because that's not going to go over well at all.
Mm,
But I'm going to mention, these other things. So I guess, like I say, you leverage your privilege where you can, but absolutely
mm.
do what we can to get others involved in the movement. But again, it's a simple idea. Private sector doesn't want to hire workers if they don't have to, and that's liable to get worse and worse and worse. So what are we going to do instead? Well, the job guarantee is wonderful, especially because it can be focused on solving social problems. And there is
Yeah,
no bigger social problem than climate change.
yeah, absolutely. I think it kind of feeds in, or it seems like a stepping stone to that like solar punk vision of the future, whereby we have loads of tech, and tech isn't coming for our place in the world because we are not just commodities of labor, but
Yeah.
rather tech is there to uplift everybody so that everybody has more time to spend with their loved ones and their community and to create art
Right,
and all this
right,
kind of thing.
right,
Like we use tech to fulfill our human existence, our lives, essentially.
right.
Um, and if, a job guarantee would be fixing social issues, that seems like the close, a little marginal step towards that solar punk vision.
I've never heard of
But
the
it does seem
solar.
to be, sorry,
Oh, I was
go
going to
on.
say, I've never heard of the solar punk vision. I just finished playing Cyberpunk 2077, a computer game, and that's not a very happy vision of the world.
Solar
But
punk is lovely. It's really,
yeah,
really
yeah,
lovely. For anyone listening, there's a lovely subreddit on Reddit of solar
oh,
punk, and yeah,
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 and they have a manifesto and everything.
right.
Um, but does it not mean, and everything that you're saying, does it not mean, eventually, does the private sector not just have to go eventually?
No, I don't think so. Think about this. Let's say we've got an economy that is, mostly job guarantee oriented, social. And by the way, I mean, what the hell did we do for thousands upon thousands of years as Homo sapiens? But we would hunt. Well, I'm not an anthropology major. My other daughter, who isn't here right now, was, but I'm not. But okay, so I'm picturing baboons, all right, wandering through the savannah, and they're hunting and gathering. Most of what they're doing really is socializing, and that's what we want to end up doing is sort of socializing, and that's what you're describing, a world where the technology allows us more freedom to socialize,
Yeah,
because that's the ultimate human. I mean, that's why people drank Kool-Aid at the, Jonestown compound is the social pressure that they felt to want to belong to something. This is where institutionalism, the stuff founded by Veblen, and neoclassical economics are most different. To institutionalists, one of the absolute prime drivers is that we are social animals and we want
mm,
to copy the behavior. We want to be a member of a tribe.
mm,
And when you understand it that way. So, but let's say that most of what's going on is sort of job guarantee type stuff. But I'd like to start a bookstore. And it's not something that's vital to the economy. And I'm going to make a profit. That's always the problem. But or restaurants. I could see a role for because not Exxon and not Citibank, but your small time entrepreneurs, I kind of view them as almost undertaking a creative act.
yeah.
Where were Melody and I the other night went to a jazz club that's fairly new here in town, and called Pinky's Champagne Room or something like that. And we're looking around at all the artwork that they had done and so forth to create this place. And I know the people who own that place were not thinking to themselves, man, we're going to get rich. They're thinking, I want to create something that becomes a focal point for our community. And I want to meet and talk to people. And I think that the market system can be a place that, also fulfills the social need for connecting with other people too.
Mhm.
So no, not that, but not to the point where, every time there's a recession, we have, billions of people out of work and so forth. But I can see it as a supplementary thing. So,
Mm.
and with a really nice, what do you call it? Safety net, to where if you screw up and it didn't work, it's not the end of your life. So
Yes.
yeah, I can still see it there somewhere.
Okay, so maybe a private sector, but a private sector that prioritizes, I don't know, improving the localized community, or like localized private sectors rather than just being for profit, machines, which if you're lucky become monopolies and then you get to be a billionaire while everybody else is like,
Right, right. And in fact, that feeds back into what you said earlier, that by the time we have this world, your ideas of what are right and just and fair will have changed. And so
Mm,
therefore, what is profitable will have changed. What is profitable
mm,
will be things that bring people together and so forth, like this place where they have, live music every night, that sort of thing. Um,
mm.
so I'll be dead by then, but I'll be very hopeful for the rest of you. So by the way, we're thinking of moving to Ireland in retirement, and so one of the things I've been checking is what is climate change expected to do to Ireland?
Mhm,
We're not
mhm.
buying property on the coast, that's for sure.
Yep, yep,
So
yep, 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 yep.
Wicklow
Although
Mountains.
it's meant to be one of the better places though, because it's an island, which essentially is this whole, you'll be safe from the climate refugees, modeling. Which is
Oh
just
Lord.
awful and terrible. It's the same New Zealand as well. New Zealand and Ireland are the top two destinations for people who are
Oh.
afraid of climate change. And I think even sort of having these models and maps and articles is really disgusting, because it just
Yes.
means that the
Yeah.
people who are able, who have access to
Right.
moving, like, the privileged can go and run away while
Yeah.
everybody else in the world,
Yeah. It's
suffers
climate
really.
apartheid is what they've talked about.
Oh,
That
yeah, 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 it's a
yeah.
great term. Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
can't remember who said that now, but I because the chapter in my book on ecological economics
Mm,
talks about that. Have you seen the TV? I keep going back to this. That's right, to connect with TV series. Altered Carbon is I think on Netflix, and it is a dystopian future where the rich have come up with a technology to where they can live forever, and they live up in the clouds. And meanwhile on the everything's a slum on the surface of the planet. And I think,
mm,
well, that's what we're headed towards. Right there is that the rich will protect themselves from all these problems and have these
100%,
mansions in the sky. And so
100%.
yeah,
Yeah,
very
I
depressing.
think the vision I always rattle on about on the show is bioserfdom. I think that, the carbon
Mm,
budgets will be bought up by the
mm.
0.01%, the resource budgets and all this stuff. And then
Right,
every
right,
other citizen will be reduced to a bioserf, kind of
right,
funding
right.
and fulfilling the lives of the
Yeah,
elite. I mean, it's
especially
kind
if
of what it is already in capitalism, but
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
that
But
was
we've discussed
depressing.
some alternatives. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
I think there's hope. The thing I always say is like the amount of people that I speak with who are actively working on the problem fills me with hope every
right,
single day.
right,
And I
right,
think that's something that needs to be shouted at. These are the stories that need to be told, that it is possible to change. We are
right.
creatures of change.
Yeah.
Um, and there's whole communities out there trying to figure it out.
I hope so. I hope so. And I think you're right. As I mentioned earlier, I'm far more hopeful now than I have been at any time.
Mm.
Being an exiled economist that isn't allowed into the main group. It, it's more and more possible for me to say something and somebody to listen, and for me to have somebody to listen to.
Yeah.
And so that's positive. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for your time. This was really, really, really interesting.
yeah, yeah. Thank
Um,
you very much.
my final question is, who would you like to platform?
Well, that's an easy question. Stephanie Kelton, number one, she's done extremely well over here in terms of getting the word out, and she's tireless. She's done a lot of work on the Green New Deal, and practically, how do we apply this? How would it work on a local level and so forth? And then Rowan Gray would be very interesting because
Yeah.
coming from a different perspective as a lawyer and talking about, and I have many more names too, but I'll just email you the rest.
Wonderful. John, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And may the force be with you.
May the force be with you too. If you want to learn more about John's work, I've put links to his books in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. As always, a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next week.